Well guys, we continue Basic Groups Chapter 1 with the subject of changes in ownership. I could probably jam this onto one recording, onto one video, but I have a hankering to divide it into two, so I'm going to do that. That's the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to have a bit of chat to this video talking about the ideas, and then I'm going to do the first example, which is called top, a question called top. I'm going to do that one, and then I'll take a break and I'll do the other three examples one after another on another recording. That's toy, love and rock. I'm also going to record, but not to this particular recording, just to keep the video sizes a bit more manageable. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about changes in ownership before I do anything. Well, let me open up a fresh new page on my clever computer here and draw a scale from 0% up to 100%. Of course, what I'm representing here is ownership, and if I can be as accurate as possible, I'll try and get the midpoint 50% right there. Excuse me. Now, in most situations, 50% is the threshold beyond which you have sufficient voting power to take control. Strictly speaking, that midpoint shouldn't really be a percentage. It should be the word control. But in question 1, in all questions that you'll be encountering that cover changes in ownership, the point at which you get control will be 50%. Now, what do they say? Is it a picture speaks 1,000 words? I think I'll take my hint from that, and I will draw the picture before I actually say anything. So this is the picture I want to teach you over this recording and the following one. I'll just give you the flavour of it. Okay. I'm going to first of all buy, that looks like 40% to me. I'm going to first of all buy 40%. And then on top of it, I'm going to buy, that looks like 20% to me. So then I'll have control, won't I? And 60% ownership. That one looks like, I don't know what it looks like. It looks like 25% to me. That one looks like 25%, that one. 25% on top of 60% will give me 85, won't it? So I won't get any more control by that third transaction. No, I won't. That looks like 10% to me. So that one will result in a drop from 85% to 75%. And although there's a change in the ownership, there isn't a loss of control. And then obviously the final transaction, which is a big transaction. I don't know what it looks like to you. To me it looks pretty big, maybe 45%. Selling 45%. Selling 45% when you've got 75% is going to give you, is that 30%? Yes, I think so. It's going to give you 30% ownership, which means you'll lose control. Now, one of these questions you've done already effectively, maybe not exactly that percentage, but the question pedal had an associate, didn't it? So you already know how to do the first transaction. That's the question pedal, how to account for an associate. The next transaction, the purchase of the 20%, that's the one I'm going to do just now. It's a question called top. So that one's called question, excuse me, ooh, excuse me, a question called top. And it's just an acquisition, really. When you gain control over a subsidiary, an acquisition takes place. but because we gained control in 2 steps, in this story it's 40 and then a further 20. Because it takes place in 2 steps, this type of acquisition is called a step acquisition. It's just an acquisition really, but they've got this fancy name for this thing called the step acquisition. So we've got a step acquisition to do, and that's illustrated by the question top. Hasn't got these percentages, but it's got these ideas. And then the next one is called toy, and the one after that is called love. And the final question is called rock. And before I record any of these, I just want to talk to you about the ideas that are presented to you up here. The first one that you see up there is pedal, right? Just got to check I'm pointing to the right side, because there's actually nothing there when I'm sticking my hand up here. But I think I've been made small on this side of the screen, so I think it's up there. Pedal is the illustration of the very simple accounting for an associate. You account for an associate with 2 lines, one on the balance sheet, one on the income statement, and you've seen it from the question pedal. The other 4 questions are the ones that are presented to you in the changes in ownership section. In the changes in ownership section of chapter 1, the basic groups chapter, you will find 4 questions, and those 4 questions are top, toy, love and rock. And you can see from me looking down there on my left hand side that I have the pages open just out of view of your camera. Now there are 4 of those fellas, but actually there's only 1 acquisition and 1 disposal. Now we're doing groups here. We're doing groups. From the parent perspective, when the parent buys some shares, the parent buys some shares. From the parent perspective, when the parent sells some shares, the parent sells some shares. So if you are looking at it from the parent point of view, buying shares is buying shares. And if you're looking at it from the parent perspective, then the selling of shares is selling shares. And that's it. There's no complication. But from the group perspective, it's quite different, because the concept is control, and either you have it or you don't. It's an on-off switch, and I can illustrate it rather beautifully by sticking my hand out of view and turning off the light. You know, either the light is on or off, right? So it's an on-off thing, control. Either you have it, and when you have it absolutely, or you don't have it, in which case you have none. So control is all or none. Now, as I say, there are 4 questions in front of you in the changes in ownership. There's top, toy, love and rock. There's, you know, the first one, the second one, the third one and the 4th one. Now, the percentages that I've represented on the board that you see just here, they're not actually exactly the same as the ones that we're going to be working through, but they are illustrative of the ideas. Now, I think it's pretty obvious. Perhaps I'm overdoing it. I think it's pretty obvious. When you buy 20% on top of 40%, that gives you 60% and is sufficient to give you control, and therefore that exercise is an acquisition. But when you buy a further 25% on top of the 60%, you already have control. You don't get more control by buying more shares, but you do get more ownership. So the 2 players in ownership, which are called the non-controlling interest and the controlling interest, which is basically us and them, the 2 different blocks of owners, the controlling interest and the non-controlling interest, us and them, when the ownership changes, there's a transfer of ownership from one to the other. When we buy some NCI from the NCI goes down and the controlling interest goes up. But when we sell shares to the non-controlling interest, the controlling interest goes down and the non-controlling interest goes up. The ownership changes, but there is no acquisition or disposal of a subsidiary. There's a change in ownership within the players, but there's no acquisition or disposal of the subsidiary. But when we have this final transaction, which is represented by the question ROC, the numbers that I have on the board, as you can work out, it's a bit complicated, but you can work out that we have 75% before we sell the 40%, and then, so I do apologise, we have 75% before we sell the 45%, and then we've got 30% left after selling the 45%. When we sell the 45%, we lose control, and therefore there is a disposal. Okay? So question top does an acquisition. Question ROC does a disposal. But toy and love are just changes in ownership between the owners. Okay? Now I don't want to overwhelm you with information because we're going to be working through these one by one, and I think it'll become more and more obvious the more that you see of this. But what I'll definitely say is that I want to record top now and make sure you're okay with that. Well, okay. When you have acquisition of a subsidiary, when a group acquires a subsidiary, it does so when it gains control. And in the case of buying 40% and then the following 20%, that control is attained at the point of buying the 20%. Okay? Now those are the numbers up there, but not actually the numbers in the question that I'm going to work through. So I've talked through the ideas that I want to work through on these two recordings. So now I just want to do one of the questions, top, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and have a look at the other three. Okay, so here we go. Question top. Like I say, it's commonly called step acquisition, but I have to be honest with you, I can't get all that excited about the word step because, you know, it's just an acquisition. You're just taking control of a subsidiary. Right, okay, so let's have a look at the numbers. At the year's start, Top acquired a 15% interest in Dog at a cost of 15 million. Now, obviously, that 15% interest would be insufficient to give control. At the year end, Top acquired a further 40% interest in Dog. But this 40% interest would be on top of the original 15% and therefore would give 55% ownership. 55% ownership is sufficient to pass a majority resolution in the other entity, therefore we have control, so Top controls Dog. Okay, at the year end. Right, at the year end, Top acquired a further 40% interest in Dog at a cost of 60 million and obtained control. The fair value of the initial 15% interest at this time was 21 million and the fair value of the NCI was 58.5. The fair value of the identifiable net assets was 100 million. The group has recently changed the policy of recognising the non-controlling interest from the valuation at fair value identified by the... no, I've got to be careful with that. At fair value... Now, my eyes aren't good enough for me not to read that right in front of me, because it is awkward, this. The fair value... Where are we again? The group has recently changed the policy of recognising the non-controlling interest from valuation at fair value of identifiable net assets to valuing at fair value as indicated by the market price at acquisition, which I think is pretty difficult to read, and it's part of the reason why I've put it in there. Now, the two different methods of valuing goodwill are, of course, called partial and full, and we've had a discussion of that already. Now, the partial goodwill is unlikely to be examined. The full goodwill is likely to be examined, and that is the policy that is given by this particular question. But actually, the way that the IFRS describes this policy is not by talking about full goodwill and partial goodwill. It talks about the two different methods of valuing NCI. And the two different methods of valuing NCI is just the share of the net assets, or it's valued at fair value. So if, as in this case, the NCI is valued at full fair value, then the goodwill will be valued at full value. Okay? So this is full goodwill that they are accounting for. They used to do partial goodwill, but they're swapping now to full goodwill. Getting in tune with the way that the International Accounting Standards Board feel about this, because they prefer that of the two choices. All that's chat really. The question is goodwill, so let's calculate goodwill. Now there's two parts to the consideration that we have. We have a first chunk of 15 and a dominating chunk of 40%. And we're going to break those two chunks into two chunks. So here we go for the goodwill. We've got the fair value of consideration, which is taken to be the fair value of the 40% that gives us control. I'm going to stick with it. I know it does seem naff, but I'm going to continue to have a little block there for working just in case I need it, because I will need it as I get closer to the exam. And also there's a fair value of what they call in full the fair value of the previous ownership, but I'm just going to say fair value of previous. The fair value of the previous 15%. Now the fair value of the 40 is not difficult, it's just what we paid for the 40. At the year end, Top acquired a further 40% in dog at a cost of 60. It's pretty easy, isn't it? You just copy that. But the 15% is a little awkward because there's two figures that represent the 15%. There's the original historical cost of 15, which was what it cost us 12 months ago. But there's the fair value of the 15 when we buy the 40, which was 21. Now what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the fair value of goodwill at acquisition. So if you're trying to get the fair value of goodwill at acquisition, you're trying to get the fair value of all the component parts at acquisition. So what is the fair value of the previous 15% now at acquisition? The answer is 21. So what we need is the fair value of the previous 15% at acquisition. We add that to the fair value of the first 40%, or the big block of 40%, to give us an overall consideration of 81. But of course there's NCI, isn't there? So we've got fair value of NCI, which, given that the business must be 100% of itself, that's 55%, that's 45%. So what's the fair value of the NCI? That's given by the examiner as 58.5. So therefore the fair value of the business must be, what's that, 0.5198, 139.5. So the fair value of the entire business is this 139.5. The fair value of the net assets is given by the question, we just copy it. The fair value of the identifiable net assets at acquisition was 100. So therefore the fair value of the people, otherwise known as goodwill, the fair value of the people involved in the business, especially the customers, is the difference between the fair value of the entire business and the fair value of the net assets. So the fair value of the net assets is 100, the fair value of the entire business is 139, so the fair value of the people must be 39, 39.5, and that's called the goodwill. Is there anything else I want to say? No, I think that's cool. There is one thing I want to say, and that is, I don't seem to be able to help myself. It is absolutely true that this line here, the fair value of the business, there you go, is actually gratuitous, isn't it? I find it very useful and I can't seem to help myself. I keep using it, I keep using it, I keep using it. I do find it very useful to get a feel for how this International Financial Reporting Standard is thinking to slot in that line. But it must be said, it is somewhat gratuitous. So as I work my way closer to the examination, you'll notice me dropping that line and not bothering with it so much. Because I'm not saying it slows you down much, but every second is precious in the exam, right? So if you feel like dropping that line, the fair value of the business, obviously you can. Right, okay, that is how the goodwill is calculated in the context of a step acquisition. Step acquisition occurs when you buy, first of all, a chunk, but it's the second chunk that gives you control. Fantastic. That's all I want to say to this recording. I'm going to continue the story of changes in ownership in the next recording. Okay, thank you.